Guten Morgen, guten Tag, guten Abend. So today we have a review of Wortstellung, which is word order. So we'll go over the broad rules in the German language for word order, and then hopefully it will help you be able to pinpoint what you may need to review in more detail. So we have, for example, the simplest type of word order you could have in a sentence. Ich habe eine Katze, which is subject, verb, direct object. So ich is the subject, habe is the verb, so we have the subject in the first position and the verb in the second position. Or you could have a similar sentence but slightly different. You could say, Ich gehe in die Schule, and we have the subject in the first position, verb in the second position. So after the verb, you could have any number of things. You could have indirect object, or you could have prepositional phrases or adverbs or adjectives or whatever else you wanted to say. But the important thing to note here is that in statements, in main clauses, independent clauses, the rule is the verb goes in the second position. So here we have our verb in the second position. And so you can also, this also applies for questions that have a question word. So for example, we have woher kommst du, which is the question word, woher, where from, and then kommst, which is the verb, and then the subject comes after. So woher kommst du is a question with a question word in it, and the verb is in the second position. Or you could say, wann beginnt der Film, starts with a question word, then has the verb in the second position, and then the subject comes after that. So questions with a question word, the verb is in the second position because the question word has to be in the first position. And so if you have something other than the subject in the first position, that means the verb's going to be the second position, and then your subject has to come right after that. You can't put it off any longer. So in these two sentences, we don't have any other things going on. It's just the subject that's left. But if you wanted to say other things, if you wanted adverbs and other objects and things, you could add those as well. But the subject would always come right after the verb in these types of sentences. So questions with question word, verb is also in the second position, same as in the statements, the independent clauses. But then let's compare these two types of questions. We have, for example, wo ist mein Buch, which is a question that begins with a question word, wo, right? Where is my book? And this one must be answered with a piece of information, not yes or no, but a piece of information. Where is my book? If you say, where is my book? And you answer yes, then the person is going to be confused and or frustrated. So, of course, you have to answer with a real piece of information. That's why it's called an informational question. So an informational question with a question word begins with the question word, and that has the verb in the second position. So the verb here is ist, right? Ist is a verb in second position. Let's contrast that with a yes or no question. Hast du mein Buch? Which is a yes or no question, begins with the verb, and there is no question word. And it is answered with ja or nein. Hast du mein Buch? Do you have my book? Ja or nein. So we have the yes-no questions, verb in the first position. Ist das ein Haus? So you see in English, is that a house? We also have our verb in the first position there. Scheint die Sonne heute? With other verbs, we used to say shines the sun today, like back in Shakespeare times, but now we say does the sun shine today, or is the sun shining? Yeah. So we tend to add do or does to the beginning of our questions now, but it's the same thing. Do and does is still a verb, right? The verb is still in the first position. We could have, for example, kommst du zur Party? Come you to the party, which in real English would be, or in contemporary English would be, are you coming to the party, or do you come to the party? But same thing, we still have the verb in this first position. Hast du das Buch? Do you have the book? As in, have you the book? Verb in the first position. And of course, I had to get an example from Shakespeare to show how we used to do this. Goes the king hence today. Yeah, verb in the first position. Okay, so when you begin the sentence with something other than the subject, then you have this type of word order. Heute mache ich meine Hausaufgaben, which means today do I my homework. As in, today I am doing my homework, or today I do my homework. So the reason that heute is in the first position there is because we want to emphasize it. And it's very common in German to start a sentence with an adverb. It just sounds very natural. So what's happening is that since we're starting with something other than the subject, we're going to still have the verb in the second position. So Mache is the verb, and it means do in this context, and it's the verb in the second position. And then when you do that, you have to, if you haven't done the subject yet, you have to do it right after the verb. And then we have meine Hausaufgaben, which is a direct object. And if we wanted to add other pieces of information, other details, we could certainly do that after the subject as well. So verb in the second position in main clauses, that's the rule. And so you cannot rely on word order to know what the subject is and what the direct object is. Because you have ich and meine Hausaufgaben, they're right next to each other. So the subject isn't, in English we put the subject before the verb. So that's how we know it's a subject. But in German, you need to be able to recognize the noun cases in the nouns and pronouns to be able to tell what the subject is and what the direct object is. So we have another example. Morgen schreibe ich eine SMS. Tomorrow write I a text message, or tomorrow I am writing a text message. So we're starting with the adverb, then we have the verb in the second position, then the subject, then the direct object. So the verb has to be in the second position in a main clause like this, an independent clause. So the subject comes after the verb, and then the direct object follows. So then we have these examples where you can say, der Hund beißt den Mann beißt der Hund. So since you're familiar enough with the nominative, how the nominative looks and how the accusative looks, you can tell that both these sentences actually mean the same thing. You can tell that in the second one, den Mann beißt der Hund, that's actually the direct object. It's in the first position, but it's been moved to the first position in order to emphasize it. So that's pretty common to put a direct object first for emphasis. And then you can do the same thing, but the other way around would be der Mann beißt den Hund, or den Hund beißt der Mann. So in English you can see we have to switch the word order to indicate what's the subject and what's the direct object, but in German you can actually just use the noun cases to indicate that. Okay, so position of the verb. In German statement, the conjugated verb is always in the second position. The main verb always agrees with the number with its subject. It agrees in number with its subject, and it's conjugated. It's conjugated to match the subject. So this was an example from Star Wars Episode 9. Long have I waited for my grandchild to come home. So you can see that Emperor Palpatine puts his verb in the second position there. Long have I waited. He doesn't say long I have waited. He says long have I waited. Or he doesn't say I have waited long or whatever. The reason he says long have I waited is because it's an archaic form in English. It's an archaic structure in English to do it this way, and it makes him sound poetic. He wants to sound poetic and a little bit old-timey, so that's why he does that. Long have I waited. So I translated this. I'm not really sure. I haven't watched the dubbed version of Episode 9 yet, but I really should, because I wonder if this is what he says. This is just a direct translation of what he just said. Lange habe ich darauf gewartet, dass mein Enkelkind nach Hause kommt. So you can see it's the same thing. Long have I waited. Long have I waited. Lange habe ich darauf gewartet. See, this is actually in the past tense. It's in the I have waited. Ich habe gewartet. But you can still see the conjugated verb is in the second position. So ich habe gewartet. Habe is the conjugated verb, and then gewartet is just the past participle. So past participles aren't really conjugated per se. So that doesn't count as the conjugated verb. Habe is the conjugated verb. Yes. Okay, so let's look at a statement, main clause, and see how we can change the word order based on a different way to emphasize things. So, ich spiele heute Fußball. It's just normal. Subject, verb, adverb, direct object. But if you want to emphasize heute spiele ich Fußball, you could put that heute to the front, and you can see how the verb is still in the second position, and the subject comes after. Fußball spiele ich heute, you could, if you wanted to emphasize soccer as opposed to something else, soccer is what I played today. So you could put that direct object first if you wanted. So first position can be any number of things that you want to emphasize. Second position has to be the verb in a main clause. And then, if you have not done the subject already, that has to come next. But if you've done it already, then you have all of your other things, prepositional phrases and adverbs and things. And then, generally, the direct object comes after those things. And then, yes or no question. Spiele ich heute Fußball? Am I playing soccer today? Play I soccer today? It starts with a verb. And then an informational question might be, for example, was spiele ich heute? What play I today? Or what do I play today? Yeah. Okay, Let's try Frau Lessing geht heute Abend ins Theater. See if you can identify what the verb is and where the position is. It's geht is the verb in second position, right? We could, for example, emphasize heute Abend, right? So tonight or this evening, Frau Lessing is going to the theater. And so we put heute Abend as one-time expression. It's two words, but it's one unit because it's one-time expression. To this evening, right? Tonight, today, evening, this evening. So it still counts as one position, similar to how Frau Lessing is two words, but it's it's one unit. So we can start with the adverb and then the verb in second position. And then we could also say, ins Theater geht Frau Lessing heute Abend, which would mean to emphasize to the theater as opposed to somewhere else is where she's going tonight. And in all of those cases, verb is in the second position, and the first position is any number of things. You could do a yes or no question with this same words just rearranged. You could say, geht Frau Lessing heute Abend ins Theater? Goes Frau Lessing tonight to the theater? Or you could say, wohin geht Frau Lessing heute Abend? Where to is Frau Lessing going tonight? Okay, we have, for example, wir trinken morgens Kaffee. So that verb is in the second position. But then we could take morgens, so we drink coffee in the mornings. You could say, in the mornings we drink coffee. Morgens trinken wir Kaffee. So we got that verb in the second position still, and then the subject comes after. Or we could emphasize Kaffee. Kaffee trinken wir morgens to as opposed to something else, right? So see how the verb is always in the second position. And if the subject is not in the first position, then the subject is immediately after the verb. And then you do a yes or no question. Trinken wir morgens Kaffee? Do we drink coffee in the mornings? Was trinken wir morgens? What do we drink in the mornings? You could say, for example, ich gehe jetzt nach Hause. Or if we wanted to emphasize now, jetzt, you could say, jetzt gehe ich nach Hause. Or you could say, nach Hause gehe ich jetzt. Home, I'm going now. I'm going home now. Yeah. Or you could say, gehe ich jetzt nach Hause? Do I go home now? Am I going home now? Or maybe, wohin gehe ich jetzt? Where to am I going now? Or maybe, wann gehe ich nach Hause? When am I going home? Wann gehe ich nach Hause? Yeah. So, how about this one? Meine Schwester kommt heute Abend ins Kino. So you can see that verb is in the second position. The subject is meine Schwester. Then we've got heute Abend, which is an adverb time expression, and then ins Kino, which is a prepositional phrase indicating a place. So you could say, for example, heute Abend kommt meine Schwester ins Kino, which would then emphasize this evening. This evening or tonight, my sister is coming to the movie theater. Or ins Kino kommt meine Schwester heute Abend. That would emphasize the ins Kino part. But the verb is always in the second position. Except for a yes or no question, then you put the verb first. Kommt meine Schwester heute Abend ins Kino? Or maybe, wer kommt heute Abend ins Kino? Wann kommt meine Schwester ins Kino? So all sorts of different possibilities with the word order rules. And then this one is just showing a slightly trickier version. Greta trinkt morgens Tee. So that seems easy enough. Greta drinks tea in the mornings. You can see how that direct object is actually later than you would expect in English. We'd say Greta drinks tea in the mornings, but this is Greta drinks in the mornings tea. So when you translate this, you need to take that direct object and move it forwards a little bit. Morgens trinkt Greta Tee. In the mornings, drinks Greta tea. Or Greta drinks tea in the mornings. And then you want to say, the thing I want to note about this is that sometimes you have the subject and the direct object immediately next to each other, and it can get confusing because you have these two nouns next to each other, and it's hard to tell which one is the subject and which one's the direct object. The way you can tell is that if you have something other than the subject in the first position and then the verb, then if you haven't done your subject already, then your subject has to come immediately after that verb. You can't put it off. So when you have these two next to each other, that first one's going to be the subject and the second one is the direct object. And then we have Tee trinkt Greta morgens. Tea Greta drinks in the mornings. So we're just emphasizing the direct object, so that is possible as well. And then we always got that verb in the second position. You could do a yes or no question. You could say, trinkt Greta morgens Tee? Does Greta drink tea in the mornings? Or drinks she tea in the mornings? And then you could say, was trinkt Greta morgens? What does Greta drink in the morning? Or maybe, wann trinkt Greta Tee? When does Greta drink tea? Starting with the question word. And verb in the second position. Okay, now we have a couple more examples with the tricky direct object situation. So, Christine besucht am Mittwoch eine Freundin. Christina visits on Wednesday a friend, or visits a friend on Wednesday. You would switch the word order in English. Am Mittwoch besucht Christina eine Freundin. So we've just put am Mittwoch, which is the time expression, to the front, and then we've got a verb in the second position. So that's easy enough. What if we, then we have the yes or no question. Besucht Christina am Mittwoch eine Freundin? Does Christina visit a friend on Wednesday? Or maybe, wann besucht Christina eine Freundin? When does Christina visit a friend? Or maybe, wer besucht eine Freundin am Mittwoch? Who visits a friend on Wednesday? And then we have the same sentence again. Am Mittwoch besucht Christina eine Freundin, second position. Let's replace eine Freundin with Karin. That's just the name of the friend, right? So you could say, Christina besucht am Mittwoch Karin. Christina visits on Wednesday Karen. What if we wanted to emphasize am Mittwoch? So on Wednesday visits Christina Karen. So it's with these two names next to each other, it can get a little confusing because you've got that verb in the second position, and then the subject comes after the verb, and then the direct object. So it's the same idea, though. Christina visits Karen on Wednesday. Yeah. Okay, so richtig oder falsch, wrong or correct. So you see, morgen geht sie zur Arbeit. That one's richtig because we've got a verb in the second position. But this one, morgen sie geht zur Arbeit, is falsch because we don't have our verb in the second position. We need to move it forward. Heute gehe ich schwimmen. That's correct. Richtig. Because we've got our verb in the second position, after that adverb. But if you said heute ich gehe schwimmen, that's similar to English, right? Today I go. But that's wrong in German. In German, you need to have the verb in the second position. And then 7 Uhr, geht zur Schule. That's wrong. Falsch. Because we need to move our verb into the second position. 7 Uhr geht zur Schule. So we have 7 Uhr as at 7 o'clock, and it's a time expression. Even though it's technically 3 words, it counts as one time expression. It's all one unit. Yeah. Okay, so that's the basic verb in the second position rule, right? And then as we progressed through the term, we did see how you can add all of the different elements, and it's like a mix and match. Every sentence has some things and not other things, and so the textbook gives us this formula for the word order in a sentence that could possibly have any possible elements, right? So this was not necessarily that useful at the beginning of your journey of learning German, but of course, towards the end of your journey, it makes a lot more sense. So now that you've had some experience with different sentences, it still seems probably kind of intimidating, but hopefully not quite as intimidating as before. So let's look at this sentence. Im Jahre 1935 kaufte sich Einstein in Princeton ein Einfamilienhaus. In the year 1935, Einstein bought himself in Princeton a single-family home. Yes. So we have the translation here. In 1935, Einstein bought himself a single-family home in Princeton. So in English, you can start out with this prepositional phrase. It's fine, right? But then in English, we're going to do the subject next. But in German, we're going to do the verb in the second position. So that's why this kaufte is in the verb. It says verb 1, meaning the conjugated verb, the first verb, because you might have a compound verb situation. But here, we just have one verb, and it is the simple past verb. So bought, and then sich is it's actually the indirect object, I-O, indirect object. It's a reflexive, but it's indirect object. He bought himself. You could say, for example, he bought his mother a house, or he bought, someone else a house. You'd see that's an indirect object as well, but he bought himself a house. It's a reflexive indirect object. And then Einstein is the subject of the sentence. And then we have adverb of place. It's a prepositional phrase that gives information about place. And then the direct object, ein Familienhaus. So you can see how this sentence is, we have the, whatever the first X is, one of the lexical items placed in the first position to emphasize it. So lexical items just means element, whatever you want it to be, right? Any element, any type of, it could be, adverb or whatever it is. So X is whatever you want to start with. Then the verb, in this case we have kaufte, and then, so the conjugated main verb. And then we have the lowercase s is for a pronoun, a subject that happens to be in the pronoun, in pronoun form, right? And then the uppercase s, it means the subject that happens to be as a noun instead of a pronoun. And then the do and the io for lowercase and are just direct object pronouns, indirect object pronouns. And then the uppercase versions would be for nouns that are indirect objects and in nouns that are direct objects. And then if you see a V2, that means it completes the verb. So, like ich habe gewartet, I have waited. That would be the past participle. Anytime you have like a verb situation where it's several verbs working together. Yeah. So we've got our lexical item at the front, which is this adverb of time. Then we've got our verb. Then we've got a subject. Then we have our subject pronoun, and then we have our direct object, indirect object. Yeah. The reason that this one comes earlier is because there are special word order rules for reflexive pronouns, so this comes a little earlier than you would expect. Yes. And then let's look at the next one. So we have Am Institut konnte Einstein an seinen Theorien arbeiten. So now we have the same thing. We're going to start out our sentence with something other than subject to emphasize it at the institute. Same as in English, you could do it that way. And then our verb, conjugated verb in this position, second position, is happens to be a modal verb in the simple past. And now we've got our subject, which is Einstein, which is a noun in this case. And then we've got an adverb of manner, like in what way was he able to work? An seinen Theorien gives more information about the manner of his working. And then arbeiten. So then we have arbeiten, which is an infinitive to complete that first verb. Yeah. So you can see how this formula works for all of these adverbs. The order is time, manner, place if you have all of those things. Okay, so then we have all these that we went over before. And of course, not every lexical item occurs in every sentence. And then it doesn't have a negation in this, for example. Yeah. So it's a mix and match depending on what you want to say, right? And so there are three basic variations of this word order formula: normal, inverted, and dependent. So normal is what we've been doing for all of the main clauses, independent clauses, which is verb in the second position, followed by modifiers. Notably, the direct object comes later after all the adverbs. So, Präsident Roosevelt verkündete im Jahre 1941 die 4 Freiheiten. President Roosevelt proclaimed, verkündete, the 4 freedoms in 1941. So all you have to do basically for this word order is take that direct object and move it forwards, because that's just how we do it in English. Or we could have, hat sie in einer Radiorede der amerikanischen Öffentlichkeit vorgestellt. He presented them in a radio speech to the American public. So you see we have subject is a pronoun subject right there, er. And then verb 1 is, see how we're in the perfect, hat vorgestellt. So we have a conjugated haben. And then our verb 2 is our past participle here. And then we've got the direct object. When the direct object is a pronoun, it comes earlier, but when it's a noun, it comes later. Yeah. And then we have in einer Radiorede der amerikanischen Öffentlichkeit. So that's the same as English, in a radio speech to the American public. Yeah. Okay. So then we have inverted word order. This is when the conjugated verb in second position precedes the subject. So, for example, you could have the adverb and then the verb. So we had, for example, this is with these two we started with the subject of the sentence, right? But with this one you can start with the adverb. Im Jahre 1941 verkündete, in the year 1941, proclaimed Roosevelt the four freedoms. Yeah. So that's what we've been doing so far with the something else in the first position and verb in the second position. Or you could take the direct object and have that be your first element and then the verb in the second position. Die vier Freiheiten verkündete Präsident Roosevelt im Jahre 1941. And so you would do that to emphasize die vier Freiheiten. Or you could even start with the indirect object. Der amerikanischen Öffentlichkeit hat sie in einer Radiorede vorgestellt. To the American public. Yeah. So if you really want to emphasize it, you can certainly start the sentence with an indirect object, and that would be relatively common in German, but not so common in English. Okay, so now we have dependent word order. This is a whole new rule for word orders, right? We had our independent clauses or our main clauses have verb in the second position, but dependent clauses have the verb at the end because the conjugated verb is in the final position. So dependent clauses have the verb in the final position. And if you have multiple verbs, then the conjugated one is the very last one. And then the infinitives or the participles come right before that one. So dependent clause is introduced by subordinating conjunction, followed by the subject and its modifiers, and then at the very end, closed by conjugated verb in the final position. So you could have, for example, wir lernen in diesem Buch, dass Präsident Roosevelt im Jahre 1941 die vier Freiheiten verkündete. So, wir lernen in diesem Buch, that's a main clause, right? It's got its verb in second position. But starting with das, that's a subordinating conjunction, das. Then we're going to have the subject next, President Roosevelt. And then we're going to have some adverb situations, im Jahre 1941. Then we've got a direct object, die vier Freiheiten. And then we have our conjugated verb, main verb 1, at the very end, verkündete. So this subordinating conjunction, das, has kicked the verb to the end of the dependent clause. And then we have, for example, in seinem Buch erklärt uns der Autor, warum Roosevelt sie uns in einer Radiorede vorgestellt hat. So now we've got this first clause is the main clause, the independent clause. It's got its verb in the second position. In his book declares to us the author. In his book, the author declares to us. So that's normal, but then the second clause is a dependent clause, and it starts with a subordinating conjunction, warum. It's a question word being used as a subordinating conjunction. And then we have our subject, then the direct object, indirect object, adverb. And then because, so if you saw the sentence in its main clause version, it would be, sie hat uns, Roosevelt is the subject, yes. Roosevelt hat sie uns in einer Radiorede vorgestellt, right? So Roosevelt hat vorgestellt is then that's the subject and these are two verbs, right? And so what happens is you have the main verb, or you have the conjugated verb last, and then you have the extra verb, which is the past participle here, that's going to be second to last. Okay. And then we have, in addition to the second position in a German statement, conjugated main verb, the most important position in the German sentence is the final position. So always read the German sentence to the end before translating. So you can say a whole sentence and then whatever that last word is will completely change the meaning of the sentence. So often the word nicht can come at the end of the sentence, negation, right? And so you can say a whole sentence and someone thinks you mean one thing, And then at the end of the sentence, you say nicht, and it just makes everything you said, you just deny everything you just said. So if someone were to say something and you think they're saying one thing, and then you're about to respond all angrily that they're saying that, and then they say nicht at the end, and you're like, oh, okay, never mind. You're saying the opposite of that. So this is why you can't interrupt people in German, because you don't know what they're actually trying to say till you listen to their whole sentence. So just like you can't interrupt people in German, you also can't interrupt yourself when you're translating a sentence, and you have to read to the end of the clause. You don't have to read to. It says you read to the end of the sentence, which is good. It's a good habit, but really you just have to read to the end of the clause. And then predicate adjectives come at the end a lot of times. The verb prefixes. We did the review of the different types of verbs, and the separable prefix verbs, of course, have their prefixes at the end a lot of times when they're conjugated in the present or the simple past. So that will completely change the meaning of the verb when you get a prefix on there at the end. And then conjugated verbs in subordinate clauses. Yeah. So all the different compound verb situations. Yeah. Okay. So when it has normal word order, read the entire sentence and then translate the subject first, followed by the verb. Because in English, that's how we do word order: subject and verb. So you can always try to when you translate, you can always try to keep a similar word order to what is in German, but you by all means, by no means do you have to keep actually the exact same word order. You can always change the word order to whatever sounds better in English. And then when the German sentence begins with an adverb or adverbial phrase, translate the adverb or phrase first, and then the subject and the verb. So you could say, heute gehe ich, today I go, right? And then when the direct object begins the sentence, you can begin with the object and follow with a passive construction. And so you can begin with a direct object as long as it's clear that that's a direct object in English. And one way to do that is by making the verb passive, or you just move the subject and just change the word order so that the subject is first. Or sometimes we had one where the indirect object is the first element. Then it's better to just simplify it and make the subject first in your translation. And then the conjugated verb always remains in position 2, etc. Okay, so now let's look at the perfect, a couple of examples for how the word order works in the conversational past tense perfect. The conjugated haben or sein takes the normal verb position, second position, and then the past participle goes to the end of the clause. So you have ich habe gegessen, I have eaten. Ich habe einen Apfel gegessen. Ich habe gestern einen Apfel gegessen. Ich habe gestern schnell zu Hause einen Apfel gegessen. So we have our subject and then conjugated verb, and then we've got all sorts of other information that goes in the order of time, manner, place. Then we've got our direct object, and then we've got our past participle we save to the very end of the clause. Yeah, and all of those. I ate an apple yesterday quickly at home. Okay, so then we have, for example, ich habe gearbeitet. Ich habe zu Hause gearbeitet. Ich habe mit meinem Freund zu Hause gearbeitet. Or maybe with all the different types of information, ich habe gestern mit meinem Freund zu Hause gearbeitet. We could even add a direct object if we wanted to. But anyway, we have our subject and a direct object, or so we have a subject and a verb in second position. Then we've got time, manner, place with all sorts of prepositional phrases and adverbs. And then we have our past participle at the very end. So when you translate, you want to identify all the parts of the verb, right? So it's actually ich habe gearbeitet. So you identify that habe and gearbeitet actually go together. And so that way you can translate them together as worked or have worked. Have worked or, so the thing is, if you translate it word for word with the same German word order, you get, I have yesterday with my boyfriend at home worked. And so you end up with this past participle in the sentence, but that's not how we do it in English. So you move it forward, you say I have worked or just I worked. And then ich bin gekommen, so here's one with sein instead of haben. Ich bin nach Hause gekommen. Ich bin gestern Abend nach Hause gekommen. Ich bin gestern Abend allein nach Hause gekommen, which is I came home alone last night. Or maybe I am yesterday evening alone home come, which would be a very clunky translation. So you can see that gekommen is the past participle. So you move it forwards to be with ich bin gekommen, I came. Okay. Then we have ich bin geblieben, which means I stayed or I have stayed. Ich bin zu Hause geblieben. I stayed home. Ich bin den ganzen Tag zu Hause geblieben. I stayed home the whole day. Or ich bin den ganzen Tag mit meiner Katze zu Hause geblieben. I stayed home the entire day with my cat. Or maybe I am the entire day with my cat at home stayed, which is not a very good translation. But you can see how geblieben is stayed. It's at the end there. And then we want to move it up towards ich bin geblieben, I stayed. And then it's like home the entire day with my cat. So you can see it's different word order, but it is all the information is there, right? So then we have the perfect word order from the textbook here. So they have at least two components. Viele deutsche Revolutionäre sind 1848 und 1849 nach Amerika gekommen. This was right after the failed revolution in Germany. And so they have, viele deutsche Revolutionäre is the subject, and then sind is the conjugated haben or sein, which you get with the perfect, and then gekommen is your past participle. That is at the end, and so you have to recognize, first you recognize, okay, this is the subject, viele deutsche Revolutionäre, and that sind is conjugated to say like they are, right? And then you realize that when you read to the end of the sentence, you realize that gekommen is actually part of this verb situation, sind gekommen, so then you can translate that as came, and then you translate everything else that's left over. So the complete compound verb is sind gekommen. The past participle stands at the end of the main clause. The auxiliary, as in the helping verb, stands in the second position because it is the finite verb. Finite verb just means conjugated verb. It's not an infinitive anymore. It's finite. It has been conjugated. And then you can see that we have our subject, then our conjugated verb, and then we have some adverbs of time and place, and then we have our second verb, which is our past participle. So the finite verb is the inflected or conjugated form of the verb. Inflected just means changed in some way. It's not in its original form, it's been changed. Indicating person, number of the subject, and tense. So conjugated meaning it matches the person, the number of the subject, and tense meaning the time. So in simple tenses, where it's only one word, the verb one is the main itself. The verb one is the main verb itself. It's like the only verb. But in compound tenses like this, the main verb, the finite verb is actually the helping verb, and then you add a past participle to complete it. So you have to check at the end of the clause whenever you see haben or sein, because you might find the past participle, and then you know it's actually the perfect, the past tense. Okay, so then we had separable prefix verbs, just to remind you how the word order works with separable prefix verbs in the present tense. So here we have some present tense sentences with separable prefix verbs. Ich komme 10 Uhr in Berlin an. And this would be the same with the simple past tense, right? Ich kam, it would be the same. This would be kam instead of comma, but you would still have that prefix separated to the end of the sentence. Ruft Sie morgen an. He's calling you tomorrow. So anrufen means to call up, right, or to call. So we've got that prefix at the end. Wir hören 1 Uhr auf. We're stopping at 1 o'clock. And so you see how auf, it's a prefix, but conjugated here, when we conjugate it, we also put that prefix to the end. Wir räumen den Seminarraum auf. Prefix is at the end. Sie steht 6 Uhr auf. She gets up at 6 a.m. Sie füllen das Formular aus. You fill out the form, or maybe they fill out the form. Gehst du heute Abend aus? Go you tonight out, as in are you going out tonight? Ich kaufe am Morgen ein. I am shopping in the morning. Ich packe meine Schuhe ein. I pack my shoes. Wir sehen nicht so oft fern. So that's why it's important to recognize that they look kind of like prepositions, right? Auf and als, an, these are actually also prepositions in a lot of contexts. But here, when they're at the end of the clause or at the end of the sentence like this, it's important to recognize this word order because you need to recognize that this is actually part of the verb. It's not just steht. The verb isn't just steht. The verb is aufstehen, but the auf has been removed, so it's harder to recognize. And then if we're going to make some participles with separable prefixes, we need to insert, we separate the prefix and the rest of the verb, and then we put the GE in there. So, hat seine Mutter angerufen. He called up his mother. Du bist 7 Uhr ausgegangen. You went out at 7 o'clock. Ich habe mein Zimmer aufgeräumt. So, then this is going to be the normal word order for any perfect type of sentence. It's just that we've got our separable prefix and then the GE, and then the rest of the past participle. So let's just look at some of these. Ich bin gekommen, I came, I have come. That's with no prefix, right? It's just kommen. But then if we have, for example, zurückkommen, to come back, you have ich bin zurückgekommen, I came back. Versus an inseparable prefix, ich habe ein Geschenk bekommen, I received a gift. So that past participle is going to look different depending on what the verb is and whether it has no prefix, separable prefix, or inseparable prefix. Then we have to review the modal verbs. So here we have the Modalverben, modal verbs, können, müssen, sollen, wollen, möchten, dürfen, mögen. And these have interesting word order situations. So können, to be able to. Ich kann nicht schwimmen. So the modal verb so here we have a present tense, right? We've conjugated ich kann, present tense. So what we're doing here is we have kann, it's been conjugated and it's in the second position. And then modal verbs are going to have, most of the time they're going to have an infinitive at the end of the clause to complete them. It's like, I cannot swim. And so the swim, the infinitive, schwimmen, goes with their kind of a unit, right? And so that infinitive is going to go to the end of the sentence. Kannst du gut Gitarre spielen? Can you play guitar well? Can you well guitar play, right? So that play, spielen, is at the end because that's just how modal verbs work. Or you could say, wir können zusammen fahren. We can ride together. See how the English is we can ride together, but the German is we can together ride. Because the two verbs are können and fahren, can ride. Those two verbs go together. But the rule is that when you have a modal verb plus an infinitive, the modal verb goes in its normal position, the conjugated position that any verb would go in. And then the rule is that the infinitive goes to the end of the clause. Könnt ihr auch mitkommen? Can you all come with too? We got our infinitive at the end. And müssen, we have some examples here. Ich muss meine Hausaufgaben machen. I have to do my homework. Instead of the literal way to do it would be I must my homework do, but it's actually I must do my homework. So you have to take that infinitive and move it back to, in English they go together, have to do, but in German they're separated. Have to stuff and then do at the end. Yeah. Musst du morgen arbeiten? Do you have to work tomorrow? Wir müssen nach Berlin fahren. We have to drive to Berlin. We have to Berlin to drive, right? Müsst ihr ein neues Buch kaufen? See the infinitive at the end. Do y'all have to buy a new book? Do y'all a new book? Or must y'all a new book buy, right? So those were this present tense, and here we have some more present tense. Ich muss am Samstag arbeiten. So you see we have our muss is in the second position, normal verb position, and then arbeiten, which is our infinitive, is at the end. And then you can see with the simple past, it's going to be the exact same word order, except for we've conjugated our verb in the simple past, but everything else has stayed the same. So with the present and the simple past, the word order is the same. all you have to do is conjugate the verb a little differently. Ich musste am Samstag arbeiten. Or, ich muss 2 Aufsätze schreiben. I have to write 2 essays. So if we want to put this sentence, it's in the present now. We want to put it in the simple past. All we have to do is change the conjugation of muss, and everything else stays the same. Ich musste 2 Aufsätze schreiben. I had to. So you can see verb is in the second position. It's just one verb, no other verbs, making it more complicated. So second position. Aber ich will ins Kino gehen. Oh, here's one rule that is important to note is that coordinating conjunctions don't count as a position. So we will have those as well later. The coordinating conjunctions are aber, oder, denn, sondern, and und. So we have aber is a coordinating conjunction, doesn't count. It doesn't. The ich is actually the first position, and then will is the second position. So we want to change this to a simple past. So we're going to say, instead of ich will, we're going to say ich wollte. Aber ich wollte ins Kino gehen. So we've got our conjugated verb in the second position, and then our infinitive at the end. Ich arbeite und dann darf ich ins Kino gehen. See how und it doesn't count as a position here, right? It's a coordinated conjunction. But then dann is an adverb. It does count as a position. And then we've got our verb in the second position, and then ich is the subject. So if we want to change that into a simple past sentence, we just take both of the verbs. One's a modal verb, one's a regular verb, and then we just change the conjugation. Ich arbeitete und dann durfte ich ins Kino gehen. I worked and then I was allowed to. And then we have, ich will den neuen Joker-Film sehen, present tense, I want to. So we just change that conjugation. Ich wollte den neuen Joker-Film sehen, I wanted to. But the word order is the same. Wollte is the conjugated modal verb in the second position, and then the infinitive is at the end. Der Film soll 122 Minuten dauern. The film is supposed to last 122 minutes. So soll is our modal verb conjugated, second position, and then dauern is our infinitive, and it is at the end. So if we want to put it in the simple past, all we have to do is reconjugate. Soll becomes sollte. Der Film sollte 122 Minuten dauern. And then mag from mögen is different from the others. It doesn't, when you want to say you like something, I like whatever noun it is, then you don't have to have another verb. It's just on its own. So ich mag den Film sehr just gets reconjugated to ich mochte den Film sehr. I liked the film a lot. Okay, so now let's talk about the word order when you're making the future tense. So the word order for a future is conjugated werden in the present tense plus the infinitive at the end of the clause. So ich werde meinen Traumjob haben, which is I will have my dream job. So you can see in English we say will have, and we put the will and the other verb right next to each other. But in German you say ich werde, which is the equivalent of I will in this context, and then you save that infinitive to the very end of the clause. So when you read this German sentence, you have to look to the end to really understand what the verb situation is, and then you can move that last verb to be next to it's a compound verb, right? So we want the compound verb to be back together because in English we put them together. I will have, ich werde haben. And then we have Bernie Sanders wird Präsident sein, which is Bernie Sanders will be president. So wird sein, will be. So we look at that sein, it's the infinitive, put it back over to the wird sein, will be president. And then wir werden den Klimawandel verhindern. We will prevent. So verhindern, to prevent. So werden is the conjugated verb in the second position, and then it is completed at the end of the clause with an infinitive. That's how the future is constructed. And of course, to remind you, this is always important to remember, werden versus wollen, because it's very tricky. So, ich will nach Hause gehen means I want to go home. Even though it looks like I will, it means I want to. And then ich werde nach Hause gehen means I will go home, the future. But you can see both of these situations, modal verbs have the modal verb conjugated in the second position and then the infinitive at the end. And the future has werden conjugated in the second position, and then the infinitive at the end. So it's not only that they look very similar, it's that the word order is the same as well. If you're looking at a modal verb sentence in the present versus the future tense sentence, the word order is identical except for the modal verb versus the werden. And then wir wollen in die Schweiz fahren, we want to drive to Switzerland, versus wir werden in die Schweiz fahren. So that's why it's really important to know the conjugations for werden and wollen, because they will try to trick you into translating in the wrong way. Okay, so now we have the passive, and it has its own word order rules as well. It is formed by using the conjugated werden in your desired tense, and then a past participle at the end of the clause. So you see the difference between the future. The future is werden plus the infinitive. Werden, infinitive. Werden, infinitive. The future is werden plus the infinitive at the end of the sentence. But the passive is werden plus the past participle at the end of the clause. So werden plus infinitive is future. Werden plus past participle is the passive. So the thing about the passive is that you can do it in any verb tense, and the way you do it in different tenses is by changing the way that werden is conjugated. So if you want a passive in the present, you need to conjugate werden in the present. Ich werde gesehen, I am seen. It's present passive because werden is conjugated in the present plus past participle. Past participle is always going to be there. So what if we want the simple past? We just take our werden and we conjugate it in the simple past because we want simple past passive. So ich wurde gesehen, I was seen, simple past. Ich bin gesehen worden, I was seen or I have been seen. This is the irregularity in the passive where you would normally want, like to make the passive, you need to conjugate your werden in your desired tense and then past participle. So what is werden in the perfect? It's ich bin geworden. Like I have become would be ich bin geworden. So if it really followed the pattern, it would be ich bin gesehen geworden. But that's not what it is. It's worden, not geworden. So what's happening is that it just, once you try to add this second past participle onto it, we already have this past participle that is created because that's how the passive is made. And so it's just a weird thing that happens with the passive perfect that you're going to say worden instead of, you might expect it to be geworden. So with the perfect passive, it's usually just easiest to memorize this construction so that you recognize what's happening with worden there. Because worden isn't, you only see the word worden in the passive perfect. It's a word unique to this situation. And then the future, so you can actually use both rules at once, right? Werden plus infinitive is the future, and werden plus past participle is the passive. So what we have here is ich werde gesehen werden is I will be seen. One of the werdens is for the future and the other one is for the passive. And then you have to have the past participle as the passive as well. And then you have present with modal verb, ich kann gesehen werden, I can be seen. So it's like I can be seen. So normally with a present with a modal verb, you would need your conjugated modal verb plus the infinitive, and that's what you're going to do here, plus the past participle because it's the passive. And then we could do the simple past with a modal would be the exact same word order, except for we're going to conjugate that modal verb in the simple past instead of the present. Ich konnte gesehen werden. Yeah. So you can see normally we have the past participle is last, except for if we have two verbs at the end, like past participle plus something else, then you're going to have werden at the end. Okay. And then, so I showed you this one. Ich bin gesehen worden. You might expect it to be something like, this is just showing ich bin geworden is normally I have become, right? So geworden is actually the past participle you would be looking for, but it's not ich bin gesehen worden. Okay, so now we have some more examples of the passive. Die Fenster werden jeden Morgen geputzt. So we have conjugate werden in the present, in the normal second position verb, and then we have the past participle at the end. That's just to note, because all of these ones before, they didn't have, they were very simple. We didn't have a bunch of other elements to show us what the word order actually is. So the word order actually is that the past participle goes to the end of the clause, right? Or we could have die Fenster wurden jeden Morgen geputzt, which would be the simple past version. But you can see we just conjugated werden a little differently, but everything else is the same, past participle at the end. So then we have die Arbeiter werden sehr wenig bezahlt, present tense, are paid very little. Die Arbeiter wurden sehr wenig bezahlt, the exact same word order, except for a simple past conjugation on that wurden. And then sind sehr wenig bezahlt worden. So if we're going to have a helping verb like sind, that's going to go in the second position. But then we have two verbs left to go. Worden is kind of a past participle. So what's going to happen here is that you have your worden at the very end, and then your proper past participle at second to last. But then for the future, we're going to have die Arbeiter werden sehr wenig bezahlt werden. So we've got our conjugated werden that goes with the subject, and then we have our past participle second to last, and then our infinitive werden at the very end. Present tense with modal. Die Arbeiter können sehr wenig bezahlt werden. We've got our conjugated modal verb in the second position, and then our past participle second to last, and then infinitive werden at the very end. And of course, when you translate, you need to put them all back together. So you identify all these verbs working together. Können, bezahlt werden, can be paid. And in English, they all need to be put back right next to each other. Simple past with modal is the same thing, but with the modal verb conjugated in simple past. Die Arbeiter können sehr wenig bezahlt werden. The workers could be paid very little, or they were able to be paid very little. Yeah. Okay, so now let's look at coordinating conjunctions I mentioned a moment ago. So it is und, aber, denn, oder, and nicht sondern really. So they are used to connect two independent clauses, two main clauses, and they don't affect the word order. They're sort of they don't affect anything really. They're just they don't even count as a position in the sentence. Meine Schwester hat mich angerufen und wir haben über unsere Pläne für das Wochenende gesprochen. My sister called me and we talked about our plans for the weekend. So we've got two independent clauses. They don't affect each other. They're completely separate from each other. Und. Or wir wollten den neuen Joker-Film sehen, aber wir hatten nicht so viel Zeit. We wanted to see the new Joker movie, but we didn't have very much time. So you can see aber doesn't count as a position. And then we have our subject in the first position, and then the verb in the second position. So dependent clause, those are all coordinating conjunctions. They go along with independent clauses, or maybe you can just connect two nouns or two adjectives or whatever, right? But so these are the simple ones, but the tricky ones are the subordinating conjunctions, which introduce dependent clauses. So here are some examples. Das, meaning that. Sagt, dass heute nicht kommt. He says he's not coming today, or in English you can leave it out or have the that in there. He says that he's not coming today. And then weil, meaning because. Ich komme nicht, weil ich krank bin. So you can see that verb at the end there. Normally it would be ich bin krank. I am sick. Ich bin krank. But here we have weil ich krank bin. The verb has been kicked to the end. Wenn, meaning when or if. Ich komme, wenn ich Zeit habe. I'll come when I have time. Or I am coming when I have time, or I come when I have time, whatever you want for that present tense verb. But the main thing here is that if I have time is in German, if I time have. Habe is the verb at the end. Ob, meaning with or if or whether. Ich weiß nicht, ob ich komme. I don't know whether I'm coming or if I'm coming. Okay, and then bevor. Ich rufe an, bevor ich nach Hause fahre. I'll call before I drive home. So see how ich fahre, that's actually the verb, fahre. But before is a subordinating conjunction that's kicked the verb to the end. Okay, so then we have how do you identify a dependent clause? Well, for one thing, it sounds unfinished when said alone. bevor wir ins Kino gehen. Yeah, anytime you have something like that, then it's a dependent clause and the verb is going to be at the end. So when you translate it, you have to move that verb back to its normal position in English. So here are some examples with these ones: bevor, obwohl, weil, and wenn. Wir kaufen Popcorn bevor wir den Film sehen. So see how the verb is at the end in German, before we the film see, as in before we see the film. So when we translate it, we go with sehen and we move it back to right after the subject. We see, wir sehen. Or maybe ich sehe den Film, obwohl ich nicht so viel Freizeit habe. I'm seeing the film even though I don't have much free time, even though I not so much free time have. So the verb is at the end. Identify the main clause and the dependent clause. The dependent clause is going to have the verb at the end, while the main clause will have the verb in the second position. So, ich will den Film sehen, weil Joaquin Phoenix ein guter Schauspieler ist. See that verb at the end. So in English, we take that ist, the verb at the end, and put it right after the subject, where we normally would in English. Ich sehe den Film noch einmal, wenn ich Zeit habe. I'll see the film again if I have time. And so see how habe, the verb, is at the end. So we put it next to the subject. So, note the verb position in the main clause, second position, and then the dependent clause at the end of the clause. It's a verb kicker. And then this one just has the colors to note the independent clause and the dependent clause. Verb in the second position, verb at the end of the clause. For this one, verb in the second position in the independent clause, verb at the end of the clause in the dependent clause. And then we have this one, ich will den Film sehen, second position. See how it's the conjugated verb in the second position, and then it does need to be completed by this infinitive at the end. But when you say verb in the second position, we mean conjugated verb. And then, of course, conjugated verb at the end of the clause. Ich sehe den Film noch einmal, wenn ich Zeit habe. Same thing, verb at the end of the dependent clause. Okay, so of course, subordinate conjunctions change the verb position in the dependent clause. Subordinate conjunctions are different than in English. They change the verb position. But coordinate conjunctions don't change the verb position. They just connect things. So the coordinate conjunctions, und, aber, denn, oder, nicht, sondern, they just connect things in a very simple way. But subordinate conjunctions, das, bevor, obwohl, weil, wenn, ob, wer, wann, all these question words as well, they kick the verb to the end. Ich hoffe, dass du einen guten Sommer hast. I hope that you have a good summer. I hope that you a good summer have. Ich möchte zu Disneyland gehen, aber ich muss zu Hause bleiben. Now we've got a coordinated conjunction. See how this is a coordinated conjunction, aber. And so, ich muss zu Hause bleiben, that's actually normal word order. We haven't kicked the verb. The verb is still in its normal position. Ich muss. Ich kann einen guten Sommer haben, obwohl ich nicht zu Disneyland gehe. Obwohl, although, is the beginning of our dependent clause, and then we've got our verb at the end. It's been kicked. Wenn ich wieder in Disneyland bin, when I am in Disneyland again, when I again in Disneyland am, hug I Mickey. Okay, so we have some more dependent clauses beginning with subordinating conjunctions. So das is probably the most common one, means that, right? Bevor, obwohl, weil, wenn, ob. And then all these question words can also be used as subordinate conjunctions to start a dependent clause. We have wer, wann, wie, was, wo, warum, all those, right? So you can see how, as a question word, it is wer ist das? Who is that, right? And then the subordinate conjunction version would be ich weiß nicht, wer das ist. I don't know who that is. And you see how in the question word version, the verb is in the second position. But in the subordinate conjunction version, the verb has been kicked to the end. Wann beginnt der Film? When begins the film? Versus ich weiß nicht, wann der Film beginnt. I don't know when the film begins. Wo ist mein Handy? Ich weiß nicht, wo dein Handy ist. Where is my cell phone? I don't know where your cell phone is. Was ist der Titel? What is the title? Ich weiß nicht, was der Titel ist. I don't know what the title is. The verb is at the end. So verb in the second position in a question word, verb at the end of the clause for a subordinating conjunction that begins a dependent clause. Yeah. Wer ist das? Ich weiß nicht, wer das ist. Who is that? I don't know who that is. Yeah. Who is that? I don't know who that is at the end of the clause. In English, this is actually interesting because we do this in English as well. So I don't know who is that sounds weird in English, right? You can't just put the question. You can't just sort of insert the question into it. You have to change the word order. Was ist der Titel? Ich weiß nicht, was der Titel ist. I don't know what the title is. If you did, I don't know what is the title, and you just like tried to put the question in there without changing the word order, it would sound weird. Yeah. Okay. So, wie viel Uhr ist es? What time is it? Technically means how many clocks is it? That's how you say what time it is. Or what? Yeah, that's how you ask what time it is. And then, weißt du, wie viel Uhr es ist? See that verb at the end. Wann fängt das Konzert an? When does the concert start? We got our separable prefix at the end there as well. Weißt du, wann das Konzert anfängt? So we've kicked our verb to the end. So see, fängt is the verb, and we've kicked it to the end, and in doing that, it's actually been reattached to its prefix. So if you have a separable prefix verb within a dependent clause, what's going to happen is that the verb is still conjugated, but it's been reattached to its prefix. Wann das Konzert anfängt. Wo kann man Karten bekommen as a question becomes, as the subordinating conjunction, weißt du, wo man Karten bekommen kann? Do you know where one can get tickets? So you see we have our conjugated verb at the very end, kann, and then our infinitive second to last. Yeah. So our conjugated verb is at the very end. And then bekommen was already at the end from before, and then we kicked the conjugated verb to the end, which leaves us with this order. Okay, so then we want some dependent clauses with modal verbs. That was this last one, right? This was a dependent clause with a modal verb, so we have more examples of that. If we want to combine, ich fahre zum Supermarkt, and then weil, and then ich muss Brokkoli kaufen, it would be, ich fahre zum Supermarkt, weil ich Brokkoli kaufen muss, which is, I drive to the supermarket because I broccoli buy must, as in because I have to buy broccoli, right? So that when you kick the verb to the end, you end up with the infinitive and then the conjugated verb at the end. Ich kann nicht kommen, weil ich mein Zimmer aufräumen muss. So we've got a conjugated verb to the end. So it's like, I can't come because I have to clean up my room. Ich fahre zur Bank, weil ich Geld abheben muss. Because I money withdraw must, as in because I must withdraw money. So the two verbs at the end of the dependent clause, you have your conjugated verb, which is the modal verb, at the very end, and then the infinitive second to last. Yes. Okay. So this is because the modal verb is the conjugated verb, and it's what you would call the active verb. It's like the real verb. And it gets plucked from the second position, and it goes to the end. So here we have a more complete list of subordinating conjunctions, some that aren't quite as common, but are also very useful to recognize. So we have als ob, before, bis, da. Da can also be an adverb meaning here or there, but if it begins a whole clause, it works as a conjunction. Damit, das, ihr. This is obsolete before. Nowadays it would be before, but ihr is an old form of that. So it sounds poetic or old-timey. And then falls, in case or if. Indem, je nachdem, according to. Nachdem, ob, obgleich, obwohl. Obgleich sounds very old. Seit, seitdem, solange, sobald, so oft, während, weil. It looks like while, but it really means because. If you want to say while, you say während. And then wenn immer, whenever. Wenn can also be whenever sometimes. And then wie meaning how, it's a question word. Okay, so just to note one other slightly complicated thing about word order and dependent clauses is that sometimes you want to start with the dependent clause, right? Sometimes you want to start with the independent clause and sometimes the other way around. So here we're starting with the main clause, ich trinke Tee. And then we're going to do the dependent clause, wenn ich Durst habe. So that's like the standard version we've been doing. Verb in the second position for the main clause, a verb at the end for the dependent clause. But then let's flip it around, and we want to, just for stylistic reasons, we want to start with our dependent clause and then follow up with our main clause. So that would be, wenn ich Durst habe, trinke ich Tee, which is your verb's going to be the end of the dependent clause, and the verb's going to be the second position of your main clause, but it kind of looks like the verb is in the first position of the main clause. But it's not really. It's actually in the second position because the dependent clause is occupying the first position. The dependent clause is one big grammatical unit. It's a microcosm of the entire sentence, so it is occupying the first position. So you could compare that example to this example. Heute trinke ich Tee. The verb is in the second position because the first position is heute, which is an adverb. Heute is the first position, right? And so an adverb, heute, grammatically, it works as the same sort of unit as the dependent clause in the one above. Yeah. So just the tricky thing about this is that you end up having two verbs next to each other separated by the comma. Habe and trinke, they're two verbs next to each other, and you might be tempted to sort of think it's a compound verb situation, but it's not. They're separate. They are two completely different clauses, and they have different subjects and everything. So now we have relative clauses, and of course it's important to review relative clauses when we review word order because they also are verb kickers. Verb gets kicked to the end of a relative clause. So we have, ein Sänger ist ein Mann, der Lieder singt. So you can see technically, if word for word it says, a singer is a man who songs sings. The verb's at the end. Who songs sings. So in English, of course, you want to move that forward because English doesn't do verb kicking with the dependent clauses, apparently. So, eine Sängerin ist eine Frau, die Lieder singt. So technically it says, a woman, or a singer is a woman who songs sings, right? But of course we're going to say who sings songs because the verb has been kicked. So we're going to move that verb back to where it was before it was kicked. Okay, so we have more of these. Ein Bäcker ist ein Mann, der Brot und Brötchen bäckt. So you can see our relative clause starts with the relative pronoun and then it ends with the verb. If it were a normal sentence, it would be bäckt Brot und Brötchen, which would be the subject and then the verb, right? But now our relative clause starts with in this case, it's the subject, and then the verb is at the end. So same thing, just watch out for the verb being at the end of the relative clause. Okay, so in the past tense, let's look at the word order here. Das sind Haferflocken. Ich habe die Haferflocken gegessen. So we're going to start with the relative pronoun. Conjugated verb goes to the very end. Participle goes second to last. So, das sind die Haferflocken, die ich gegessen habe. This is the oatmeal that I ate. Or if we're going to do a more word-for-word translation, these are the oat flakes that I eaten have. So it's like eaten have, gegessen habe. But of course, we wouldn't do that in English. We would just say I ate, or maybe I have eaten. Yeah. Okay, so another one with the relative clauses in the past tense, in the perfect. Das ist der Film. Ich habe den Film gesehen. Two separate sentences, two separate independent clauses, but now we're going to combine them. We're going to start the relative clause with the relative pronoun, which is going to be den. Conjugated verb goes to the very end. Past participle goes second to last. So, das ist der Film, den ich gesehen habe, which is, this is the film that I saw, which is a nice translation. Or a more Yoda translation is, this is the film that I seen have. So you have the past participle and then the conjugated verb at the end. The verb has been kicked to the end. And then one other thing to review about word order is that sometimes we have situations in which we want to put our verb first. We had the yes or no questions, obviously, already. But then we have verb first conditionals, which will have you putting your verb at the beginning of the sentence to express something very specific. So here was the children's song. Mein Hut, der hat drei Ecken hat mein Hut, hat nicht 3 Ecken, dann ist es nicht mein Hut. So the thing is, normally you would say hat nicht 3 Ecken, like you would. Why is this verb at the front, right? It's not a question. There's no question mark. So why does this statement? Why does this main clause statement have the verb in the first position? That's weird, right? It's because it's just one little trick that can happen is that when you have your verb in the first position in a statement, main clause statement, it actually implies a conditional. If it does not have 3 corners, then it's not my hat. So, of course, in English we say, should you arrive early, please wait here. And that implies if, right? The word if is not there. Like, there's no if here. But it implies if you arrive early. It's a hypothetical situation. Should you arrive early? If, right? And then the German would be, sollten Sie früher ankommen? Bitte warten Sie hier. Or maybe, had I known that this would happen, it's really the same as saying, if I had known this would happen, right? So we have the verb had in that first position, and that implies conditional, yeah. Hätte ich gewusst would be the equivalent of that. Had I eaten the eggs, I would have also gotten salmonella. It implies if I had eaten eggs. It implies a hypothetical. Hätte ich die Eier gegessen, dann hätte ich auch eine Salmonelleninfektion bekommen. Yeah, so we had, wenn Karl liest, schläft ein. You can do it with the wenn, obviously. That's a choice that you can make if you want to say wenn. It makes it very clear. But it's also possible and very common in academic writing to leave it out and it's just implied. Liest Karl, schläft ein. So it's just implied by the word order that the if is actually in there. And then so is very common. It's very if you see that so at the beginning of the second clause, then it's really, really clear that we're implying if here. So all these 3 sentences mean if Karl reads, then he falls asleep. So you see that the word order, that verb first, it contains not only grammatical information, but actual, there's content to the sentence there, not just structure. Okay, so then we have, wenn sein Sohn etwas erreicht hat, ist jeder Vater glücklich. And then you could do that same sentence, hat sein Sohn etwas erreicht, ist jeder Vater glücklich. Or you could have the so optionally and usually is there as well. Hat sein Sohn etwas erreicht, so ist jeder Vater glücklich. If his son has achieved something. This one is important to note because it's actually in the perfect. Hat erreicht. Erreicht is a past participle. So in English, has achieved, past participle. So just note that it's that conjugated verb that goes in the first position when we're doing something like this. And then the other verb, if we're in a compound verb situation, the other verb that would normally be at the end is still at the end of the clause. Yeah. So omission of wenn in conditional clauses. Wenn man Erfolg haben will, dann muss man arbeiten. So you can say wenn, that's like this one, right? Wenn, you can totally use the wenn, or you can leave it out and just start with the verb. Will man Erfolg haben, dann muss man arbeiten. Wants one to have success, one must work, right? So you see that conjugated verb is in the second position, and then whatever other word order rules you would have with that like verb situation, then you would also have that'll just apply. Like with a modal verb, you're going to have your infinitive at the end of the clause. Yeah. Wenn eine musikalische Komposition verloren geht, verliert die ganze Welt einen Schatz, which could be changed to just start with the verb instead. So wenn is now gone. Geht eine musikalische Komposition verloren, so verliert die ganze Welt einen Schatz. So you can see the word wenn has disappeared, but we're still going to use it. In the translation, we're still going to say if, because it's still implied. Okay, so here are the Übungen. As a review, translate this final review text from our textbook. So you can look on page 273 and following pages, and that's where you will find this text. And of course, I have it for you here as well. This is the text, and it has a glossary, and it has all sorts of fun verb situations and word order. All the different word order rules, of course, show up in the wild in this text. And so I would invite you to translate this text. So translate it yourself. And then a few slides after this, I have my translation. And of course, it doesn't have to match exactly, but that's how translations are. Sometimes they don't match exactly. But let me know in our next Zoom meeting or in an email, or you can set up an office hours Zoom meeting with me whenever you would like about any words, phrases, or structures that are unclear to you in any of this last text for you to translate. So, vielen Dank und Dankeschön für das Semester und wir sehen uns vielleicht bald. Maybe I'll see you again very soon. Tschüss, auf Wiedersehen, mach's gut.